terms of things that we were talking about recently, we had graduated up from the cellular level and even a little bit of the tissue level. We had done an introduction to tissues because we said that that will be an important component of your lab this weekend. Because this weekend you're doing two different labs. You are doing that of tissues, where you're touring through epithelial tissues, and then you are doing integumentary system, which overlaps very well with this. Okay. Last time I had mentioned that the link to the photos that you were using online was actually not working. And even though you guys forgot to remind me, somehow, I don't know how, I remembered it on my own. So I believe that the link now for the extra study exercise that we usually have in Canvas does now link to an online web album where you can see the photos, reminding you the same photos that we'll be using for the quiz itself. Okay? So photos of different types of epithelial tissue. Simple squamous epithelium, simple columnar epithelium, things like that. I even wrote in the directions because it takes you to a web album that includes all kinds of different tissue slides that are commonly used for the year-long Anatomy and Physiology. And so I reminded you that you only need to look at the first, I think it's like 8 or so, only the ones that are epithelium, and that's it. So those are just giving you examples of what they look like so that when it comes to the quiz and we show you that same photo, you can then recognize that that is stratified squamous epithelium or simple columnar epithelium, etc. And like usual, with those questions coming up, they will ask you, for instance, name the particular tissue, and it will say also, like name a place that you can find it in the body. Okay? So make sure that you're going through and doing that. Like usual, when you get to the end of the exercise in the lab manual, read through that section that says, for the quiz be able to. It should say stuff like, identify the different specific epithelial types, blah, blah, blah. But make sure that you can always do those different things that it's asking you, because that's what we're expecting for the quiz. Okay, so we went from cellular level to tissue level to our first organ and organ system level when we were talking about the skin. So let us do a little bit of review, even back to the cellular and tissue level. So one of the things that we said when we were talking about tissues is that there were 4 main tissue types. You guys remember the 4 main tissue types? Yeah, so there's connective, and there's muscular, muscle tissue, epithelial that you're going to be looking at in detail, and then nervous tissue. So those are the 4 main tissue types. And so each one has its own particular function. Like we said, kind of connect and protect for connective tissue. We've got covering and lining for epithelial tissue. We've got movement, even heat generation, something like that for muscle tissue. And then nervous tissue is kind of communicate and control. So when we have more than one tissue type, that gives us an organ. And when we get into organs in our first organ system, we were talking about an integumentary system. So when we are looking into the skin as an organ, we were saying that it has how many layers to it? 2 layers. Everybody gets confused and they start thinking that it's 3 layers and it's only 2, right? So the more superficial one, using terminology, right? The one that's not as deep, what's that layer called? Epidermis. So that's the one that you can see. Everybody has their epidermis exposed right now. You're showing it off to everybody, right? Hopefully nobody is having their dermis exposed, because once we get down to the dermis, that's where the different receptors are located, that's where the blood vessels are located, etc. So if you had dermis exposed, that would be a breach of our defenses, because the epidermis we know is there for protection as well as insulation and things like that. But we would also see that that blood might be escaping and there'd be other issues associated. So we've got 2 layers of the skin. When we were talking about that epidermis, we saw that it's made up of one particular tissue type, a covering and lining tissue type, which would be? So it's epithelial tissue. So we had our 4 tissue types. Of the 4 categories, it's epithelium, but then it's also got all those layers to it. So we call it stratified squamous epithelium. So it's stratified, it has more than one cell layer, and the individual cells are flat in their shape. Remember, that's how we said that most of our different specific tissue types are named. One part of the name tells you how many layers, and the other part of the name tells you the shape of the cell, whether it's squamous and flat, whether it's cuboidal and cube shape, or whether it's columnar, tall rather than wide. Okay? So, because the epidermis is going to be there for protection, we want a lot of layers. So we have all kinds of like 30 to 40 stratified squamous epithelial layers in it. Now, we also found, this is one of the last things that we touched on, is when we look into that epidermis, those cells are organized into either 4 or 5 strata, or layers that you can actually pick out, either in the microscope or in the drawings and stuff like that. And we said that the difference between 4 and 5 layers, 4 layers you're going to be finding in most areas of the body, whatever, on your forehead or on your back or on your thigh or something like that. But there are a couple areas in the body where you need an extra layer, so you have 5 layers. What are some of those areas? On the hand and soles of the feet. Those that get a lot of physical abrasion, you need thicker skin there. So 5 layers of the epidermis in those areas. So we had that little weird phrase to help us remind ourselves of the layers, right? What was that phrase? Anything about it? Had to do with something. Ball, yes, right? So, and there was Charlie, right? Charlie likes green super balls, right? So what we have there is all, the first layer of the 5 layers or strata inside of the epidermis. The outermost one is the stratum corneum. Then we have the stratum lucidum. Then we have the stratum granulosum. Then we have the spinosum. And then we have the basale down below. Okay? And as you go from deep to superficial, the cells get further and further away from the blood supply, and so they tend to die off as we get to these more superficial layers. Definitely corneum and lucidum, those epithelial layers are just dead cells. They're just there for physical protection that we have on the outside. Granulosum is about the area where we transition from living to dead. And we said between areas that have 4 and 5 layers, it's the lucidum, which is your optional one. Okay? So, palms of the hands, soles of the feet, you have all 5. Other places, this stratum lucidum, this clear layer is not there. You just have the other 4 instead. We also talked, a few of us talked at the end of class yesterday as well, that the thickness of these cell layers, even this one, can vary as well. So you've got sometimes in lab we'll do some labs where we do what we call discrimination tests. We're kind of testing with special senses and other senses, thermoreceptors and touch receptors or mechanoreceptors and stuff like that. And there's one that's called a 2-point discrimination test. So if you can imagine like a compass, not like a compass on a map, but you know how like to draw a circle, you have that little pointy thing and the pencil on one side and the point on the other side. It's been a long time since I've used one too. But regardless, we use these 2 points, and we'll go through tests where you use these 2 points and you'll touch them to the patient's skin, and you'll ask them whether, when they can't see, whether they can feel 1 point or 2 points. And if they feel 2 points, then you move it together. And you touch it again. You feel 1 or 2, 1 or 2. And in certain areas of the body, you'll get a discrimination that is much finer. Like you'll be able to tell them, you can still tell 2 points, like on your face, really close together, compared to someplace like your torso. And that has to do, number one, with how many receptors you have around. Certain areas have a lot of receptors because you need to be sensitive there because there's important things going on there. Meanwhile, other areas, like, as long as I know that I'm not like totally burning myself or something like that, then it doesn't matter if I can really tell the difference between being right here and right there. But it also has to do with the thickness of the skin. Because if you have really thick skin, right, then you're not going to be able to feel things maybe quite as much. So the thickness of the number of layers or number of cells that we have in each of these layers can also vary. So if you develop something like a callus, like you've been working again, and you get a thickened area on one particular finger or on your hand, you can imagine that area, if you have ever done so, it's not as sensitive, right? Because you have all those extra dead cell layers like the stratum corneum piled up there as well. So it's adaptable too. Even though we have 4 or 5 layers, the actual thickness of that epidermis can vary depending on the body's needs. So certainly as we're going through, when we talk about the body, some of these structures are static, like for instance, you're only going to have 206 bones or something like that. But other ones are kind of dynamic. When we start talking, like I was talking in my other class this morning about cardiovascular system, we were talking about capillaries, which are the smallest blood vessels in the body that are all over the place, in between almost all of your cells. And as you grow, whether you grow this way or whether you grow this way, you have more cells and you need more capillaries. So you can actually grow more capillary beds to serve all of those new cells that you've developed for whatever reason. And in fact, as you shrink, if you end up losing weight or something like that, then the body's like, why are we maintaining those? It will actually decompose those capillary beds and get rid of them as well. Now, we're not talking like major arteries and veins. You can like grow it and then like regrow it and stuff like that. But on a very, very small scale, it's just an example of how dynamic the body actually is. It can change and respond to the environment, much like we talked about kind of life functions that we need as a living thing. Okay. So, we left off when we were talking a bit about tattoos, and we were transitioning to talking from first about the epidermis and now down into the dermis. So, of the two layers of the skin, we said the epidermis is more superficial. It's made up of stratified squamous epithelium, and the dermis is really where we have a lot of things going on. So it's a much thicker layer of the skin, and it's very diverse in terms of the different tissue types. And because we have more than one tissue type, that means this is the area where we remind ourselves that the skin counts as an organ, right? And in fact, some of these things, like you see this thing here, this is called the erector pili muscle, this is your goosebump muscle, even the hair follicle, they are in fact made up of more than one tissue type too. So this erector pili muscle has muscle fibers mostly in it, but it's even got some nerve or neurons, nervous tissue in there, probably even has some epithelial tissue wrapping it. So even that minuscule little individual muscle that's pulling on that hair follicle to make that one hair stand up counts as an organ. So again, if we have more than one organ, then this whole thing that we see here also counts as an organ system. And that's something that we'll talk about today as we get down here. It's also something that you'll see as you go through the lab. So you need to know about these things that are called accessory organs of the skin, like erector pili muscles, hair follicles, even things like nails, etc. Okay? Okay, so dermis. The dermis is under the epidermis, and it attaches the epidermis to, for instance, the subcutaneous fat. There are actually ridges between the dermis and the epidermis that work to keep them attached. So, in fact, if you look at our last slide here, the border between them is wavy. You see like that? And so that way, when you have an epidermis sitting on top of the dermis, there's less of a chance that even with a lot of pulling action, that you're not going to have the epidermis like sliding right off the dermis. That would be a bad thing. So if we have this kind of interdigitating aspect of the epidermis and the dermis, they're kind of locked together physically in that way. Now, on the palms of the hands, soles of the feet, those dermal ridges that kind of go up and down actually translate even to epidermal ridges that we call fingerprints and toe prints, right? So that's just exaggerated dermal ridges that we see everywhere. They're just much bigger, giving more traction, etc. on those fingers and toes. Okay, so it has an uneven border between them. When we look at it, the main tissue in the dermis is connective tissue, connecting the epidermis down to underlying tissues, but also knitting together a lot of these other structures that are going to be in there. So it's got a lot of connective tissue in it that has collagen fibers as well as elastic fibers in it. So when we talk about a tissue, there are certainly cells in a tissue, but a lot of times there's this extracellular matrix, this other goo or fluid in between the cells, and it may have fibers in it, much like if you're talking about concrete or cinder block or something like that. If they really need added strength, they may put like rebar going through it to reinforce it, like reinforcing steel or whatever. So the skin needs to be strong as well. So it's got different types of protein fibers going through it. Collagen fibers are thicker and stronger. Elastic fibers, you would imagine, have a little bit more flexibility because you want to be able to kind of pick up the skin and have it change shape and go back to its original shape. Now, through time and with sun damage and things like that, those fibers actually degenerate. And so then you start getting wrinkles, it starts getting less elastic, etc. But those are in there to give it strength as well as give it flexibility. There's going to be blood vessels down there we saw. We said that the epidermis, which is way at the top, is avascular, okay? It doesn't have blood vessels going into it. The lower levels, like the stratum basale, like we talked about down there, they will, the kind of the nutrients and the oxygen will diffuse or percolate up to those cells, but there's no blood vessels going through, which is why those upper layers, those more superficial layers, die off. But in the dermis, we definitely have a lot of vascularization there. So one of the things we said is that that's going to be important for, like we said, maintaining heat or maintaining thermal homeostasis, but also just delivering nutrients and oxygen and all kinds of things to those cells that need to be able to survive. So we have a lot of blood vessels in the dermis. The dermis also has all kinds of other things in it. It's got lots of sensory receptors in it to allow us to kind of sense what's going on in the outside world. This is our interaction space with the outside world. So we need mechanoreceptors so that we can feel something that's pressing on the skin. There are thermoreceptors, there are pain receptors, etc. So all kinds of receptors that tell us about the world around us. Hair follicles that we'll talk about, sebaceous glands, and sweat glands. So glands are going to be modified epithelial tissue that produce some type of secretion. So sweat glands are pretty straightforward. Anybody know about sebaceous glands?
Oil.
Yeah, oil glands. So these, as we'll see coming up again, these are going to be secreting oil right onto the hair and the hair follicle. So when you talk about oily skin or having some sort of infection of your sebaceous gland, it's in a particular pore. The pore is the opening that leads to the surface from the sebaceous gland that's down in the dermis. Okay? So it secretes it onto the hair and onto the hair follicle. It comes open in that pore. But if that pore gets clogged, or if it gets bacteria in it, right, that's when you get like a pimple. That's an infected little area that has then your bodily defenses have to go and get rid of those bacteria and try to then heal it over. But the sebaceous glands themselves, as they produce that oil, it's actually trying to keep the hair follicles lubricated. And in fact, some of the sebaceous glands, as well as the sweat glands, that gets onto the skin. You definitely know so like later in the day, right? You ladies can call it a shine, but we know that's sweat and oil and stuff. But, you know, it gets onto the skin and also helps to kind of seal the skin a little bit, retard water loss, and keep it a little bit more moist as opposed to drying out. Okay. So we'll come back to some of those individual structures in just a minute. But the other thing that we want to remind ourselves of is that, in fact, there is another layer under the skin that's called the subcutaneous layer, also known as the hypodermis. Now we said that it's not a layer of the skin, it's not a separate organ per se, but it's associated with the skin. So this gives us extra cushion, physical cushion, right? Physical protection, and it helps to insulate us as well, right? Just like wrapping the hot water heater with fiberglass or something like that doesn't really happen in Arizona because we don't have a lot of cold temperatures, as we were discussing. But if you live someplace cold, they actually wrap the water heaters with insulation so that you don't lose all that heat radiating to the outside environment. And so the subcutaneous layer, which is mainly adipose tissue, i.e. fat, is there to give us extra layers of cushion and insulation. More so in the winter when we get cold. So that's our big excuse, you know, when we gain pounds around Christmas time. Just like, I'm just, you know, thermoregulating, that's all. I'll lose it later on. Bikini season could happen. Okay. So, 2 layers of the skin and underlying subcutaneous layer. Now let's take a tour through some of these different accessory organs that we find down in the dermis. And the first one are going to be those hairs and hair follicles. So the hair follicle, in truth, is going to be even that surrounding pocket that we see down in the dermis. So it's going to include, the hair is going to be going down into it, the hair root is down extending into it, but the hair follicle is going to be all these specialized cells that create kind of a pocket for it that actually create the hair that allow the hair to grow. So that hair follicle is going to be in the skin, down and passing through the epidermis down into the dermis, and it's going to be all the specialized cells that are creating the hair that then allow it to grow and push up from there. Okay? So that hair can be found in nearly all regions of the skin. There are some areas where we don't have hair. There are some areas where we prefer not to have hair as well, and you're doing these pluckings and all this type of thing. But regardless, most areas of the body do have hair. Palms of the hand, no. Lips, there are some areas which don't actually have any hair. Not even any minuscule amounts. But most areas do. And growth for these hairs, regardless of where they are, occurs down the face in the follicle. Now, on one level, you might wonder, okay, so what's the difference then, if we're talking about different types of hair, what's the difference between hairs like eyebrow hair that only seems to grow so long and hair on top of your head and stuff like that? Well, the hair that grows there, the follicle that creates the hair, goes through active and then kind of inactive cycles. And so the active periods for hair that grows longer is just a longer period of active growth before it kind of goes, if you will, dormant or inactive. When it goes inactive, then those cells of the follicle are not creating anymore, and so it kind of becomes, the root of it becomes a little bit loosened, and it ends up falling out. But shortly thereafter, at least until we get older, shortly thereafter, the follicle becomes active again and starts secreting another hair that grows out of that same exact follicle. So for hair on your head that grows really long, the active period is really long before it goes inactive. But if you're talking about hair on your arm or hair on your face or eyebrow hair or something like that, the inactive period comes much sooner. So the rate of growth for those hairs are about the same. It's just that these ones are falling out at a much faster rate, so they don't have a chance to get too long. Except for that one random one, right? You got that one random one that grows up here, and you just kind of brush it up here and just go in. Ear hair or something like that. Yeah. So that's kind of the difference between the lengths of hair that you might get. All right. Other things associated with hair follicles, there are those muscles that I mentioned called the erector pili muscles that attach to the hair follicle and allow it to stand up. Now, erector pili muscles are a type of muscle that we call smooth muscle. It's involuntary muscle, so it's still going to contract, it's still going to relax, but its activities are kind of subconscious, involuntary. So in that way, unlike, for instance, skeletal muscle, where you consciously tell these muscles to move and move me, etc., smooth muscle is kind of under the radar in terms of controlling it. There's definitely the brain's in control, contract, relax, etc., but it does so at a subconscious level. So muscle along the gastrointestinal tract to make your muscle churn when there's food in there and move things down, along your blood vessels to cause them to vasoconstrict and dilate, to control blood flow and blood pressure. That's all smooth muscle, same as what we find in the erector pili muscles. So the role of these erector pili muscles are really to help with thermoregulation. So what's the main time that you get goosebumps? When you're watching scary movies, that's right. I'm going to show you that Krampus preview, and then you're going to be all scared and everything too. I almost watched it, and then I didn't. What's a scary movie at Christmas time? Come on, that's not right. Anyway, so when you get cold, that's right. So when you get cold, these muscles tend to contract and you get goosebumps. So what's the idea there? Well, the idea there mainly is that when muscles contract, they generate heat. So the ATP, like we were talking about, that they use in order to shorten and make these filaments slide, some of that chemical energy is lost as radiant heat energy. And so, much like if you were cold and you're like moving like this and that generates heat, all of those little hundreds of thousands or more erector pili muscles contracting will produce heat and help to generate heat and maintain your internal condition. On another level, of course, if you have other mammals, right? Mammals have hair, that's the whole thing you learned in elementary school. Other mammals that have a higher density of actual fur and hair, then it actually gives them some more insulation. So if they get cold, or if they are, in fact, it's more emotional, if they get aggressive or something, think of a cat or a dog, right, and puts hackles up or something like that, that has to do, they'll do that when they get cold, and what happens is the hairs that they have, if this is the surface of the skin like this, when the hairs are laying down, maybe it looks like that, and when the hairs stand up, because those erector pili muscles, usually you've got an area of air that gets trapped underneath the hair, under here. And if we extend the hairs and make them stand up, then we've got a thicker layer of potentially insulating air that you've warmed, to then warm up the body. So it's a bit like scuba diving, right? So the idea with the scuba diving, a wetsuit, is that you put it on as an extra layer, and it's not that it keeps you dry, that's why it's called a wetsuit, by the way. It keeps a layer, a thin layer of water next to you that your body heat warms up, and then you have not only the warmed water, but then you have that neoprene of the wetsuit, so you're getting more insulation. So in animals that actually have a lot of hair, when they have their hair stand up, they may actually be able to generate a warmer layer of insulation or insulated air. Now if they're doing it because, whatever, they're being aggressive or something, that's something totally different. It just makes them look bigger instead. So in terms of us and being scared and things like that, probably is like an evolutionary leftover that like, oh, I'm scared, and when I get scared, I better look bigger, because then if someone's going to attack me, maybe if I look so big, it's not going to attack and kill me. Meanwhile, you're just going, beep, 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 beep. That doesn't really scare anything. So anyway, erector pili muscles, accessory organ of the skin found down the dermis, cause the hairs to stand up. All right, other things. When we're talking about hair, you think about color. So blonde hair, red hair, brown hair, black hair, etc. That has to do mostly with the amount of that same pigment that we said colors the skin, called melanin. So in that hair follicle, there are a lot of active epithelial cells there that are creating the hair itself down the hair root, and they are putting a lot of melanin granules inside of it. And so it's obviously genetically determined in terms of hair color for the most part, unless you pay extra for it. But your native hair color is genetically determined to a certain extent, but it also does change with time as well. So as you get older, it may get grayer, and what happens there is those active cells, the follicle that are secreting melanin, they become less active. So again, you start losing a little bit of hair, those cells aren't as active, and they start then not putting in as many melanin granules. And if it finally, in fact, if it turns white, there's a transition. It's like graying, and then white later on. Later on, those cells are, in fact, not putting as many cells into the hair. Air bubbles start to get trapped inside of the hair. And so the air bubble, air doesn't really have any color. So that's when it really turns bright white. It's later on when air starts entering into the hair as well. Okay, but most of the color comes from melanin. There are some other, like in terms of people with red hair, there's trichoceridin, which is another pigment that has the reddish coloration. So that goes into it as well. But for the most part, it's varying amounts of melanin. So lighter color hairs, less melanin. More melanin, darker brown, black, etc. Okay, so this is what we were talking about. We were talking about everything that was found down here. Erector pili muscle. There's the hair follicle. So you see these pink and red layers right next to the actual hair root? That's the follicle here. And so the growth mainly occurs down here, and then it pushes that hair up. Now in terms of the hair itself, remember that this is kind of our border between the two regions of the hair. If it's below the skin, we call it the hair root. If it's above the skin, we call it the hair shaft instead. So that is actually the anatomical definition of that. For many, it's the second time I've done that today, oddly enough. Did it in my other class too. Caught the microphone on the shelf, knocked it off. Anyway, for people that are talking about, for instance, hair color and stuff like that, they're like, oh my goodness, you can see my roots. Hopefully, nobody can see your roots, because the roots are down below the skin. So unless you have a big cut on your head, nobody's seeing your roots. You're just seeing the most recently grown part of the root now get shifted up to the shaft where you can see it, where it's not necessarily colored the same as what you've had it colored on. Okay? So technically the roots are down below the skin, and the shaft is what is exposed and that you can see. A couple other things we can see in here. We're going to talk about coming up different types of glands, but while we have the picture, here's the sebaceous glands. See how the sebaceous glands are associated with the hair follicle? So they're producing their oily secretions onto the hair follicle, goes up here onto the hair, as well as onto the skin. Okay? Other glands that we have here, we have a couple different types of sweat glands. And all of these glands produce some sort of secretion that then dumps into a pipe that leads to the surface. Okay? So this one here is called an eccrine sweat gland. We'll talk about other types as well. Look, see, sebaceous glands. So sebaceous glands are those associated with the hair follicles and secrete oil, which we also call sebum. It waterproofs and moisturizes the hair shafts as well as the skin itself. Now the funny thing is, right, it's protective so that the hair doesn't dry out, so the skin doesn't dry out, etc. But we don't like it, so we spend all kinds of times like washing it off and washing your hair and stuff like that with something that is a little bit more pleasant smelling. But then what happens, right? You're washing your hair too much, you're getting rid of that natural oil, and then you're like, oh, now my hair is dry. So now you gotta use conditioner to put some sort of sealant on it, just like your body was trying to do at first. But, you know, it's a fashion type of thing. So, sebaceous glands are there to keep the hair and the skin healthy and moisturized, and even there are actually some antibacterial properties about it as well. Other things that we see, nails. So nails at the end of our digits are modified epithelial cells that have a whole lot of a protein in them that's called keratin. So if you remember when we were talking about cells, we talked about the cytoskeleton and how there are 3 different types of protein fibers that we find making up the skeleton of a cell. We said they're like microtubules and things like intermediate filaments and microfilaments. So intermediate filaments, those types of proteins are like keratin. And in the skin, in the surface of the layers of the skin, of the epidermis, we have a lot of keratin there for protection. But the material that makes up the nails has an even higher concentration of keratin. Makes it strong, etc., compared to just the flexible skin. So with these, they're also stratified squamous epithelial cells with a ton of keratin inside of it to make them harder, just like the hair. Hair also has keratin in it to make it harder, to make it tougher. And as it grows, it's going to grow, again, down towards the base, down here, and it's going to grow its way out, just like we saw for the hair. It tends to grow down here. This is our border between the actual skin tissue and the nail tissue, so that's our cuticle. Anatomically, it's called the eponychium, so if I move that out of the way, you can see it there. You have that little white area as well, that's here, which is called the lunula. And the lunula it's not anything special per se, but what it is it's a thickened area of the nail bed. So right in here, it's a little bit thicker than it is down at the distal part. Remember proximal distal, right? Distal's out towards the tip. So at the tip, you have the free edge here. This is the part that you chew on when you're taking your exam, okay? But down here, where it's actively growing, that's the lunula, and the lunula is thicker. And so because it's thicker back here, you can't see through it as well. So if you're talking about CPR and stuff like that, that's one of the places, if you're worried about somebody, are they breathing, are they going hypoxic or whatever, you look at areas of thin skin where you might be able to see the underlying blood supply a little bit better, right? We said that that's another thing that gives the skin its color. It's not only the melanin, but the blood flow, like if you are, like you said, embarrassed or something, very red, or if you're pale and you're going to pass out, we know that has an influence. Well, in areas of thicker, thin coverings to the blood vessels, it looks lighter or darker. And that thickened area, the lunula down there, is just thicker, so it looks whiter. But you're supposed to be, when you're assessing hypoxia, you're looking at the nail beds. Do they look reddish or pinkish, or do they look blue? Same thing with the lips. Skin there is pretty thin, so those will change color more readily than maybe the thicker skin here. Okay? So those are the things that you end up checking to see in terms of how well their blood is oxygenated. Okay, other things, sweat glands. So sweat glands, the official name for those are sudoriferous glands. That's a fancy term. And there's 2 different categories of them. The eccrine sweat glands, the ECC ones, are the ones that we saw on that first slide. And those are found most everywhere. And the main thing that stimulates them to secrete their sweat is temperature, right? So if your body temperature is getting too high, then those are going to sweat. The sweat evaporates on the skin. It's going to help to cool down. So that's going to maintain thermal homeostasis. The other ones are kind of interesting though. Apocrine sweat glands are bigger ones. They're only found in discrete areas as well. So these are going to be found in areas, for instance, like the armpits, in the axillary region, right down towards the groin, and places like that. And those sweat glands definitely put out salty sweat, right? Water plus electrolytes, etc. But they also put out other types of proteins 2. And when they put out those proteins, the apocrine sweat glands, those sweat glands are going to be putting out this extra protein that in some ways may have chemical stimuli in terms of communicating sexually. You hear about pheromones and things like that. It is packaged with these apocrine sweat glands, but then also those extra proteins end up being like food for bacteria. The normal salty sweat, there's not a lot of things to eat in there for bacteria. But apocrine sweat glands, right? The sweat that they put out, when it comes out, does not really stink. It has proteins in it and stuff like that. But those extra proteins end up as bacteria food. The bacteria eat it, reproduce, etc. And it's that bacterial colony that tends to grow down there, especially later in the day, that ends up smelling. So then what do we do about that, right? So what do we do about that? We got 2 ways to deal with that. Besides washing, right? You've got deodorant or antiperspirant. So deodorant usually has a couple things to it. Number 1, it has pleasant smell, and it may have some antibacterial properties to it, right, to keep the bacteria from growing. The antiperspirant, on the other hand, what that is, right, it's got a different consistency to it, right? So it has a lot of waxes in it. Waxes are a certain type of lipid that's solid, like a candle. So it's like taking a candle and going, and what you're doing there is you're effectively putting wax caps into all of those sweat gland tubes, preventing the sweat from coming out, preventing the bacteria from getting to it, so then you don't sweat as much, the bacteria don't get to it, etc. Of course, then later on, right, you're in the shower and you're like, can't get that off because you got that big layer there, but whatever. Okay, so sweat glands. One other modified sweat gland that we tend to mention are ceruminous glands. Ceruminous are modified sweat glands that secrete earwax. And again, in the same way, it's kind of coating the skin that leads into the ear canal. It's also somewhat protective because it can catch things in there that may be, dirt particles or something like that. Keep them away from the delicate tympanic membrane or eardrum that's down inside of that canal. So it's protected in that way. But obviously a little bit different than the actual sweat that we see in other places. Okay. Oddly enough, mammary glands are also modified sweat glands. Same type of thing. You've got a coiled gland underneath the skin. It's got a duct or a tube that leads to the surface. But those, in that case, modified sweat glands that produce milk. Only in women. We'll talk about that at the end of the semester. If you don't know about that yet, just wait till the end of the semester. We'll tell you all about mammary glands. Okay. We're going to leave it as a mystery until then. Alright, so like we said, skin helps to regulate body temperature. We can dilate our blood vessels and we can sweat in order to get rid of heat. We can constrict the dermal blood vessels, inactivate the sweat glands, and even shiver to create heat if we need to. So it's going to be a balance of those types of activities in order to help maintain internal temperature. Okay, other things associated with the skin. Other things associated with the skin are things like skin cancer, burns, and things like that. This is a protective layer, but necessarily, because its main job is to be the first line of defense, it's going to take a beating. And so, it's going to show damage in other ways that maybe the underlying tissues won't, since it's protecting them. So, for instance, skin cancer. It's a big issue, of course, in places like Arizona, where we're exposed to a lot of the sun. And what happens is you want to be doing checks of your skin to make sure that it's healthy, that it's not becoming cancerous or precancerous. And so there are these what are called ABCD guidelines for skin cancer and making sure that your skin is healthy. In fact, they've added a new one recently called E. So first one is asymmetry. So what does asymmetry mean? It's asymmetrical.
It's like the same on both sides.
Right, exactly. So if something's symmetrical, it looks like it's in a mirror, like one side's the same as the other one. So in this case, if you have a spot, like a mole or something like that, and you've got one side that kind of looks roundish, and then the other side kind of gets jagged and grows out here like this, oh, well, that's a problem. Cancerous cells are your own cells that have, through kind of mutation or for whatever reason, they now are reproducing out of control. rather than doing their normal job of connecting or protecting or contracting or whatever, they're just like, oh, we're supposed to reproduce, 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 reproduce. That's all they do all the time. And that builds cancerous tumors, etc. If some of those cancerous cells break off and then end up going to another organ or another tissue, that's called metastasis. So you talk about metastasizing tumor, that's when you're really talking about cancer that you're very concerned with, because it's not localized anymore, now it's actually spreading. So what you're looking for when you're trying to evaluate the skin is you're looking to see, are my cells, it's fine if cells grow and reproduce, but we're looking for something that says they're doing so at an abnormal rate. So in asymmetry, one side of it's okay, the other side is growing really fast, so the shape of it is changing in an odd way. Border is something also that you look at. So again, something that is fairly regular in terms of its border, as opposed to having areas that really extend out at odd angles. Okay, because that would show growth at the edges of it. Color is the same thing. A lot of times, again, especially in the skin, you're going to get moles. You're going to get like melanocytes that are secreting a lot of melanin. But if you get more and more of those, then you get darker patches, you get lighter patches in the same area. Those darker patches suggest that those are a lot more active cells over there, more so than the other ones. So that's a little bit of a concern. So different colors in the same spot, and then diameter. So in truth, with the diameter, you know, you're looking for something that's probably no bigger than your pencil eraser or something like that. Okay? So maybe, you know, 5 to 6 millimeters, something like that. If it gets bigger than that, it's not necessarily a problem, but if it gets pretty big, that means, again, it's actively growing. So you want to look at big spots. And again, if you've had one through time, it could be fine, nice and round, same color, whatever, and all of a sudden, for whatever reason, now it starts growing, or a certain part of it starts growing, or it starts changing color. Those are the changes that you're looking for. And that's the other thing that they've added in terms of dermatology, is they've added E for evolution. And when we talk about evolution, we're just saying change. Be aware of change for those particular spots. I don't care if you've had a mole on that limb for like 20 years or something like that, so I don't care about it. You've got to take a look at that too, because it may change at any time. Okay? Okay, so you should know the A, B, C, D, and in fact E guidelines for monitoring for skin cancer. The other thing that we see with skin and its protective role is that at some point you may also get a burn to the skin. So with the burn of the skin, you hear about first and second and third degree burns, and you know that as the number goes up, the severity goes up. But what does that actually mean in terms of layers of the skin or structures involved, things like that? So, what's that? Yeah, the depth of the skin, exactly. So we know we have epidermis, we have dermis. How extensive are these burns going? How deep are they going? Definitely how broad they are is important too. So like that's talking about when the burn area exceeds 70%, over half the victims die, because we say that's a defense out there. And now you've got most of your body that is non-defendable, that anything can come and access it. We say that we're going to be regulating temperature. How are you going to regulate temperature there? It's just exposed, right? Think about whatever, going out into the winter without your outer layers on. Being exposed is a very bad thing. Likewise with moisture, etc. So with burns, there's a few different things that they're assessing with burns. The severity of it, as well as how broadly it is covering the victim. So you tend to use a quick assessment that's called the rule of nines. If you look at the surface area of the body, if you average it out, it kind of breaks into multiples of 9. So for instance, if we look at the anterior side of the trunk, that's about 18% of the total surface area of the body. Each arm on the anterior side, about 4.5%. So if you have them both on the anterior side, that's 9% right there. Thighs are both about 9%. As well, when you go down here, the legs and the feet, that's also approximately 9% too. So together, this would be like 18%, 18%. So when you look at that, that's one way for them to quickly say, okay, how much of the body is actually involved? What level of protection and what type of treatment do we need to do based on the severity of the burn in terms of its distribution as well as its depth? So first, second, and third degree burns, as you see laid out here, on the left side, not as bad, right? First degree burn could be like a sunburn. It really just affects the epidermis. Epidermis is there for protection, okay? Half of those cells are dead anyway, so that's not such a problem, but you're damaging the skin a bit, right? So you get a little bit of inflammation, you get a little bit more blood going there because we've damaged those epidermal cells. Now we need to make some more in order to reproduce those that were really damaged. And so we have more blood flow there. You have heightened sensitivity as well, right? Because you want to protect that area. Now that there's damage to that particular area, we want to protect it. That's why you get sensitive. You're like walking out the next day, you're like, oh yeah, I got a sunburn, I got to put something on, right? You can feel that extra sensitivity in that area while it needs to heal. Second degree burns are going down into the dermis as well. Now at this point, rather than just redness, you usually get blisters showing up too, because you've damaged enough of our protective layers that the body's like, I don't know, we got to put something over there, like sandbags or something, because whatever happened, even if it's just shoveling or something like that you don't usually do, and you've got a blister now, that repetitive motion, the body's like, oh great, I don't have thick enough skin in that area to really withstand all that, so I'm going to try to put up something to help defend. So you usually get blisters as well as redness, etc. Now, even though you're damaged down to the dermis, a lot of these tissues that are down here can still recover. I mean, you may not have full sensitivity. The hair-like structure that comes back may be a little bit different, but this is a good chance for recovery from second-degree burns. Third-degree burns, though, go all the way through the skin. And so now you don't even have the beginning tissues to start reproducing from or building from again. You've effectively cleared those out. And so at this point, you usually have to do things like skin grafts, where you're actually taking healthy skin from other areas of the body and laying them on there and then having them kind of knit with the surrounding healthy tissue again. Because there's no way, like I said, it can't build up again because you've blown through the whole thing. Okay? So first, second, and third degree burns. Not a happy way necessarily to end the lecture, but it does have to do, certainly, with skin and some of the things that we go through with our own skin. Okay, so questions on skin?
So a blistering sunburn is technically a second degree burn?
So it can be that severe. So, there's two things in terms of a burn. It can be intensely hot for a short period of time, right? Like touching the stove or whatever. Or it could be slow burn. And the problem is you left it out there longer and longer and longer. And so just a little bit of time, ooh, I got a tan. A little bit more time, ooh, I got a burn. Now it is possible for it to even get worse. Now I doubt that you could get to a third degree burn through sun. I mean, you're out in the desert and you're out there a week or something like that. There's going to be all kinds of other systemic issues you're going to run into, but I don't think you would actually get to the third degree burn at that point. I don't think. So, other things about skin. Dead silence is a no. All right. So why don't we do just a little introduction into skeletal system so that we can get a jump ahead and to be that much closer to being prepared for the exam itself. Now remember, bones are not on the lab work this week. So this is truly going into the next week. But the following week's lab, I think we have 2 weeks of bone labs. So what we're going to find coming up as we do this general introduction is that your skeletal system divides into 2 groups of bones. Those that are kind of centrally located in what we call the axial skeleton, and those that are more peripheral that we call the appendicular skeleton, right, associated with the appendages. So there's enough bones in the body. How many are there? 206 bones in the body. When you're younger, there's actually significantly fewer because as you are developing, some of those bones actually haven't fully formed. You start out with, and we'll talk about this sometime, you start out with these cartilage models for bones when you're really young, and you don't have truly ossified bones as of yet. So you start out with fewer bones, and then you end up with the 206. Now technically you can have even more than 206. In some ways, especially with the skull, which is part of the axial skeleton, there's a lot of bones that make up the skull. And that's why actually we have just 1 week of doing like skull and axial bones first because there's so many of them, and then we have a second week where we do appendicular. But in the bones of the skull, especially the ones of the cranium that surround the brain, these bones are big, flat bones that kind of knit together like puzzle pieces. But along their joints, which we call sutures, sometimes as they're developing, right, in the cranium of the baby, as they're developing, you may get little, small bones that are inside of the sutures. Like instead of these big bony plates coming totally together, maybe it'll stop right there, and then you'll get a little, what they call sutural bone, that forms in between them. Now you're never going to know whether you have those until like somebody later on looks at your skull and goes, oh look, there's a couple sutural bones right there. So technically that person would have whatever, 208, 209 bones in their body. So there are some cases where you have a few more, but for the most part we're talking about 206 bones. And the interesting thing about, some interesting things about bones is, remember this is an organ system. So if this is an organ system, what are the organs that make up the system? Like if you're going to name an organ of the skeletal system, what would you say? Bone, right? Any of those bones. Femur or cranial bone or nasal bone or whatever, each individual bone counts as an organ. It's mostly connective tissue, but there's also going to be nervous tissue going to it, because if you break a bone, you're going to know it, right? You can feel it. There's also going to be epithelial tissue, some covering and linings in there. So because there's more than one tissue type for each one of those bones, it counts as an organ. Okay, so those are the different organs. And rather than being, like some people think about, they're just like sticks that kind of prop us up, each individual organ is made up of living tissues that are secreting, that are needing oxygen, that are needing glucose, and all that type of thing. So bones are actually very active tissues. Not as active necessarily as the skin, right? You're replacing those skin cells all the time. And I don't know what the stat is, but probably, like you said, like every month or so, you probably have a fully rejuvenated epidermis. The bones in your body also remodel themselves all the time. So they're constantly taking tissue out of there and kind of giving it up, like calcium, etc., and then storing new calcium and phosphate in there. So they're remodeling all the time. And there's another stat, it's on the order of months, I think, that each individual bone kind of reforms itself. It's not like it disappears and then reappears, but there's that much activity within the organ itself. So each bone is an organ, and bone functions include, obviously, things like protection and support, but also muscle attachment. So when we talk about movement and muscular system after the first exam, those skeletal muscles are called such because they attach to the skeleton. If you just had a hunk of skeletal muscle, right, that would just look like the steak that you might be eating tonight or something, right? Because when you go to the meat department and you're eating meat, that's actually muscle. And in fact, as you get into it, and you talk about cuts of meat and stuff like that, you can actually see where those bits of muscle come from. Loin on the thigh and things like that, ribs, intercostal meat, there's all kinds of things like that. T-bone steaks actually come along the vertebral column along here, okay? So the bone that forms a T inside of the T-bone steak, right? So that's where it gets its name, it's like this, right? There's your big T-bone, actually somewhat crossed like that. And then here's your steak like that, okay? This is actually part of a vertebra. This is part of a vertebra, and then the vertebral extensions come out here. So there's a big hunk of muscle that's right along here, along your vertebral column, that forms this section, and then other little sections as well. So the point there is not to turn you off of meat and make you a vegan or anything like that. But the point there is that muscles are attached to bone, and when the muscles contract, they're pulling these bones to produce the large-scale movement that moves your whole body. So bone is considered important in terms of movement. It's also important in blood cell production. We will find that some of the biggest bones have inside of them spaces or cavities where red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are produced, and produced on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute basis. There are millions of red blood cells that are being produced by your bones right now and going into circulation, because your red blood cells only last about 3 to 4 months. And you have billions and billions of red blood cells transporting oxygen, but they're wearing out all the time, so we have to produce new ones all the time. If you were to take your fingers, this is the smallest size, and make a little box about so big that you can barely see through, that's like a cubic millimeter right there. Inside of that amount of blood, there's like 5 million red blood cells. and you've got like 5 liters of blood circulating around. So your bone tissue and organs are really, really active in terms of blood cell production too. Storage of minerals is a function that people often think of with bone in terms of, oh, I need calcium for my bones, and I don't want to get osteoporosis, etc. And that's certainly true. And when we think of storage, you're like, okay, I get calcium, I drink milk, make some strong bones, etc. But the thing that is a little bit more interesting there, I would say, is that we say storage of minerals, but it's like storing things in the refrigerator. You don't think when you put something in the refrigerator or the cupboard, you don't think, whoa, that's gone forever, I'm not going to see that again. Right? It's not a black hole, you're not just like stocking it there. You put stuff in order to take it out later. And it's the same thing with the bones. So when you are taking in calcium with your milk or whatever, you are storing calcium and phosphate that will be used by your tissues, not only your bones, but your blood and your muscles and all kinds of tissues. That's just like a place for you to hold it temporarily until those tissues need it. And when the tissues need it, they're actually going to pull it out of the bone. And that's that part of that whole remodeling process. Okay, so when we start thinking, again, broad scale in terms of skeletal system, we think of the individual bones as organs, and we think of how they work together as a whole system. And the bones, obviously, comes in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. Now this that we see here is kind of our generic bone. Like if you were going to draw one, it'd be like some sort of cartoon Fred Flintstone bone or something like that. Some of you might know that reference, others are like, I don't know. But when you think about it, you've got big ends to it and a narrow center part to it. That's your generic bone. And there are a lot of bones that are like that, mostly in the limbs. Okay? But there's a lot of other bones that have very odd shapes. Like we say, cranial bones are kind of have a little arc to them and they're very flat. Vertebrae, like we were talking about there, have these weird projections and a hole going through the center. They have all kinds of odd shapes to them. But the shape of them has to do with their particular function. So if we take all that aside and we look at a generic bone, like in this case the femur, where's the femur? Thigh, right? So like we were talking about, we got a lower limb, hip to knee, that's your thigh, knee to ankle, that's your leg. So we have a thigh bone here, and it has the expanded ends. The ends are called epiphyses. So luckily those both start with E. The official anatomical word for the ends of a bone, like a long bone, are called epiphyses. You can see there's a proximal and a distal one. This is where the knee would be. And then the middle section, the middle shaft, we call it diaphysis. We also look at the fact that bones, when we look inside of them, they're not just a solid stick, like I was talking about. They have spaces inside of them. Notice that there is kind of this similarity, if you will, to M&Ms. Did I say that before? No. Yeah? No. So they're like M&Ms to a certain extent. In that, with M&Ms, right, you have a hard candy shell. It's hard on the outside and it's relatively soft on the inside. Same thing in terms of bones, okay? When you look at the bone there, you can definitely see some place on the inside that you would figure to be a little bit weaker. Here's that hard candy shell out here, right there and there. This is called compact bone. Compact bone, due to its density and organization, is super strong. When you get to the inside, some places we have spongy bone, and it's not that it's spongy like flexible spongy, but the fact is that it has some holes in it. It's called sometimes cancellous bone. It's got holes in it like that. And then the very center of these bones, we often have what's called a medullary cavity. So an actual space on the inside as well. And so what's the deal with all of these holes like that? Well, in the spongy bone that we see up here, spongy bone, that's where we typically have red marrow. And red bone marrow is where the red blood cells and the white blood cells and platelets are actually produced. If it was solid bone, there'd be no place for these cells to reproduce and make new cells. We have to create spaces for them, little homes. That's why we have spongy bone, okay? If we look at the center with the medullary cavity, that's actually filled with blood vessels, nerves, so that you can feel it. Also has yellow marrow in it instead. Now, red bone marrow is producing red blood cells and white blood cells, etc. Yellow marrow is in fact fat. So there's adipose tissue or fat stored inside of bones, yet another storage capability of bones. Fat, adipose tissue is just for energy, stored energy you're holding there for later. Yeah.
In this picture, it shows that you have a vein and artery that leaves the bone.
Yes.
Is that how it really is?
Yeah, definitely so. Even if you have especially long bone, you may have more than one artery and vein that are entering and exiting that bone. So if we think about it, that's why even when you have a break or something like that, obviously the surrounding soft tissues are going to be damaged, so there's going to be blood there in the skin and the muscle, but the bones themselves will actually bleed due to their vascularization.
So that's why for a cardiac arrest, I would do an IO in the femur or in the humerus.
Yeah.
For those particular reasons.
So for looking at the blood vessels here, you can do samples if you're looking for something that is wrong. If you're looking for like creatine kinase or something like that, which is an enzyme that occurs in the heart that allows it to make ATP. When the heart cells are degrading and dying off, sometimes that enzyme gets released and you can pick it up someplace else. And that is an indicator that there's some sort of problem there. And so these are blood vessels that are hooked into everywhere else. So if you take a blood sample, that can tell you about a lot of different regions in the body. But also sometimes you may get clots or something like that that can show up in other areas, even sometimes in blood vessels associated with bones too. So the other reason we have arteries and veins there is that, like I said, there's going to be all kinds of active cells in the insides of bones. And when we have an active cell, they need oxygen, they need nutrients, they need to get rid of waste products. So we've got to feed them with an appropriate blood supply. And so we have that in there. So it goes inside, it comes out of. When you make new blood cells, they've got to be able to get into the general circulation. So that's some of the pathways that they have to get in and out of these kind of stick-like homes that they live in. Okay, so we've got yellow marrow in the medullary cavity. We have red bone marrow that makes our different blood cells in the spongy bone that we see on the inside there. That's getting to be like a delicacy too. You see that, right? That's like dogs like bones. What do they like? They like the marrow. That's where the fat, that's where the protein is. Because red bone marrow is a lot of protein because of the blood cells that are there. It's getting to be like a human delicacy thing too. You can go to like fine restaurants and you can get marrow bones. They just like, you get a plate of them, there's just cracked bones there.
Actually,
Placenta.
It tastes, I mean, you're talking to people, it tastes very good.
But
No,
bones,
that's
actually,
the-
it's really good.
Yeah.
That's what
It's
they're,
actually really
that's
good.
one of the things they're selling with the bones is placenta.
Placenta.
I don't know if it's sensitive.
Yeah.
I don't know about that one.
Selling them where? Like in the grocery store? Where?
No, at like fine dining restaurants.
Fine dining restaurants. Really? So you're looking through the menu and they're like, oh, there's that too.
It's human placenta, yeah.
What?
Human placenta.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, it's like some trend for beauty products.
Well, they're
Eating
doing that,
placenta.
how you could send your placenta out and make placenta pills.
Yeah, the encapsulating placenta, that's a huge trend now.
Yeah.
And
So-
they're just a license for it.
What does it do?
There's a lot of nutrients in your
Well,
placenta.
and
Which
there's
makes sense
There's a
because you know,
lot
that's,
of
it's
nutrients.
supporting the baby and stuff like
Most
that.
other animals, when they give birth,
They
they
ingest
ingest
it.
the placenta for the proteins
Nutrients.
and the chemicals that are only produced during pregnancy. So we actually miss out on that because we've evolved out of it. So encapsulating it makes it a little bit less like you're eating this alien headdress that just came out of you. You're just eating a pill.
My captain did that. He had a baby. His wife sent it off. I was like, you're disgusting.
Yeah.
She made her own pills?
No, she sent off the
Oh.
placenta, and like a couple weeks later,
Yeah, they
got.
sent her.
Well, and it's supposed to be one of the things that makes it so that so many women are having issues with breastfeeding because they're not ingesting the thing that fuels it to begin with.
Interesting. There are a number of hormones, etc., that do come from the placenta to maintain pregnancy, etc. But yeah, pros and cons. Yeah. Generally, you don't eat others' placentas or anything. I don't, there's got to be some restrictions on that, I'm sure. But you had a question too?
Or just, yeah,
Comment.
yeah, well, a couple of days working in the airport and I busted my hand up over there pretty good. And when I went in and it was all bloodied up and stuff, but there was like a clear liquid that was leaking out of my hand
Yeah.
and stuff. So I was wondering, I asked the doctor, he told me it was bone marrow and stuff. So I was curious, is that the red marrow? Stuff is cool. The yellow marrow is just fat in your
Right.
in the bone.
Yeah, that's a good question on that level.
Or is that the plasma?
Exactly. So there's a kind of a combination of things. So like if you get a good scrape and you get down to the dermis, right, and you see a little bit of blood coming up, you may also see some clear fluid coming up as well. So sometimes that is just some of that extracellular fluid like plasma that is kind of leaking through, but the blood cells are still being retained.
Now, is that through the bone or is that through?
So in that case, we were talking about the skin. It could have happened, coming from the surrounding tissues of your hand. It's possible for you to get marrow coming out because if you break these open, it's in there.
Well, 'cause
but
I mean,
it generally has color to it.
Because I actually saw like my bones and stuff in my fingers and stuff that was cracked open and stuff,
Right.
so I could actually see it
Yeah.
and stuff. So I was just curious what it actually was.
Something else you get associated with bones, and the last thing that we hit with this chapter, which obviously we're not going to get to today, but we start talking about joints, where bones come together to be joined. And when you have flexible joints called synovial joints, when we talk about membranes, right? We talked about cutaneous membrane, skin membrane, mucous membrane, serous membrane, and synovial membranes. So synovial membranes are where these joints are coming together, and there's that egg white-like fluid that are in between them so that they don't grind on each other. Now, it could be that you had enough damage to all of these because they're movable joints. Every one's going to have a synovial joint associated with it. So it could well be as well that you had, some synovial joint fluid coming out from all those different joints that were kind of damaged too. I mean, like I said, when we were doing that cadaver dissection this past summer, and we cut open the knee joint, clear, very slippery fluid just coming straight out of it, and that's the synovial fluid. Yeah. I don't think they have that on a restaurant.
I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe next. You can do like a little shot of it or something. Okay, so why don't we stop there, because we did get a little jump ahead. We'll let you guys out a little bit early. That's kind of a plus on both sides of it. We'll pick up here then on Tuesday. So don't forget to do your labs this week, having to do with tissues, having to do with integumentary system. Remember to read the question. If it asks for name the structure and the function, make sure to give that part too. Okay? All right.
So, question, this, on the test question, a chain of
Yeah.
I guess if I would
That's a good question. So it's kind of a fine line. Polypeptide is going to be